And on your reformer notes, we're going to go ahead and get started by talking about the major people that you need to know who are your reformers. Now, if your name does not get picked as some of the reformers, sorry, okay? But these are the most likely ones you're going to see on the AP exam. So, the first term on the top of your reformer packet. Oh, by the way, on your reformer packet, just a quick reminder, our class average right now is a 65% in this class because 40% of you did not turn in the reformer packet. So, if you didn't turn in the reformer packet, please get that in. No, sorry, not this packet. The Tinder profile page online, the assignment that you guys did, that should have been turned in online. If you turn it in by today, I won't mark it as late, but please turn it in. I gave zeros to everybody who I don't have one from. Sound good? Okay, so first term is what is called the antebellum period. And this is a starred term. So the antebellum period is the period of time that is considered the pre-war period. So again, the antebellum period is considered the pre-war period. And basically, the whole goal of the antebellum period, and this is a term that you'll see on the AP exam, if you want to put next to this the dates, it's usually referred to as 1830 to 1850. Now, if you ever see an AP exam question, oftentimes they'll say antebellum reformers or something like that. So that's just a key to be able to help you. So let's go into some of the reformers. Now, the vast majority of these can all be referenced with religion. So if you ever get a causation of why did the reform movements happen, I would definitely talk about the Second Great Awakening. So we've talked about the First Great Awakening previously. The Second Great Awakening is going to be that major Protestant revival. And all of a sudden, all these churches are going to come out of it. And several of you actually belong to the most successful church that came out of the Second Great Awakening. Now, this is what is known as revivalism, which is the idea of reviving religion during this time period. So a lot of this idea was basically, it was like a come to Jesus moment. We need Jesus again, we need God again, and we're going to create all these churches at this time. So for example, one of the major starters of this is going to be a guy named Charles Finney. And he was a preacher in what's known as the burned over district. So especially in New England, there were so many churches that people were going to, that in New York, for example, there was over 700 different churches with the same beliefs. And every single one that you went to all said, if you don't choose this religion, you're going to hell. Well, how are you supposed to choose when every single religion has the exact same beliefs and they're all telling you that they're the right one? So people literally got burnt out of religion at this time. So instead he says, let's create some certain religions that people can join so that we can revive this religion. So now we're going to go into one of the most famous examples of these, which are what are called utopian communities. And this is also a starred term. So a utopian community is a community where basically they were attempting to make the perfect societies. Now, in a perfect community, oftentimes they're religious, but they could also be economic communities. So I want to give you one example. If you guys heard about recently the horrific things that happened in Mexico over the last couple of days of the 9 people who were ambushed and killed, they were in a utopian community of FLDS members. So they were in a community for a religious purpose in Mexico, and 10 years earlier they actually had people who were killed by the same cartel, and people are asking, why didn't they just leave? That's their utopian community. That's their perfect society where they can practice their religion. So that's what a utopian community is. Here in Utah, we're a utopian community. When the original Mormon religion came, they went from Illinois, Missouri, and then here to escape religious persecution. That's why the state of Deseret, that's originally a utopian community. for that purpose. So again, could be religious or could be economic. Now, if you want to bracket the next three terms are all examples of utopian communities, but the most famous is going to be the Shakers. So I would highlight Mother Ann Lee and star the Shakers. Out of all the utopian communities, she's the most referenced, and if a DBQ is going to happen, my guess, Mother Ann Lee is going to be the one that's going to be on there. Now, her religion is actually really cool to talk about because it was very unique. So their idea is that everybody is full of sin. In fact, everything that you do is all about sin. And you're so sinful that you must get rid of sin. And the best way to get rid of sin is through shaking it out through dance. So here's how it works. If you think about religion nowadays, you pray to God for forgiveness. You go to your priest to be able to be commuted of your sins, whatever it could possibly be. In this case, though, you literally dance to get rid of all that. So what they would do is for 12 to 18 hours a day, for 6 days a week, they would dance. And this was to get rid of all the sin of themselves as well as their different communities. So when they did this, all the dances, I don't know, what do you guys do at homecoming? Do you do like little, like this thing? Do you do like little shopping carts where you like do that? What do you guys do when you dance? You just stand there and go like this? Okay. Well, at this time, they don't do that. They have very perfect performance dances that are specific to ways of getting rid of the sin. So I'm going to do a shaker dance for you. Okay, now, what do you mean, oh no? I'm a great dancer, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to show you this dance. One thing about, so I'm really not that great of a dancer, you guys are going to think it's really weird, but this is actually the original dance of how they would get rid of their sin. So I want you to imagine yourself, you've done a lot of sin today. You've thought badly, you've sworn at people, you lied to somebody, and now you need to literally shake all of that away through dance. So you and your friends get together, and you decide to do the sin dance. Okay, so this is the sin dance that you would do. You guys ready? Okay, so this is what it's showing. So you go hands like this, and you go 1, 2, 3, rid yourself of sin. 1, 2, 3, rid yourself of sin. And that's what you did for 12 to 18 hours. Okay? Now that literally, every time you do this move, that gets rid of all your sin. So that's literally throwing sin out into the world. Okay? Now, these shakers this is what they were known for. And sometimes the sin got really bad. If they began to feel like their community was so sinful that they needed to do a mass dance, sometimes they would have days that they did dances for 3 to 4 days straight without stopping to eat, sleep, or drink. And that was what you did, is you constantly danced to get rid of all the sin in the community.
Wait, how do you not, like, pass out?
No, they did, but that was like a coming to Jesus. Like, when you passed out, they were like, God is here with us, because they were passing out of sin and things like that. Oftentimes, they would actually pull them up, and they would hold them up and cause them to dance more. Yeah. It was a crazy time. Now, does anybody know of a shaker today? No? That's because they don't exist anymore. Because the original shaking community had a big problem. If you think about today, the reason why a lot of churches get new members is because they have kids. Traditionally, you are the same religion as your parents and your grandparents. Shakers did not believe in procreation. Because of that, they had no kids. Because there's no kids, there's nobody to join the religion, and the religion literally dies out. As in the last shaker dies, that religion is now gone. Okay? Which brings us to the, I forgot about this. I have a joke. You guys want to see the joke? Yeah. Why do people keep saying, oh no? It's a good thing.
That's fine.
Okay, so here's your joke about the shakers. It's really funny. I know it's going to be hard to read for some of you, but it's pretty funny. You ready? Here's your joke. Get it? It's funny. Ha ha. Ha 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 ha. Ha ha. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So anyways, so we'll go into the next religion that they had. So the next religion is the Oneida community. Now, this community actually lasted very long. It lasted until about 1890, until the federal government shut them down and arrested half of them. Now, you might say, why? Well, here's what's that?
Sounds like Waco, Texas.
Waco was a little bit more intense, although I would call Waco a utopian community because that was their goal. But their goal was a little bit more like government, politicians. This reason's a little bit more icky of why, both of them were icky, but this one's a little bit more icky of why they were destroyed. So what happens with the Oneida community is this was actually extremely popular. It lasted almost 80 years before it was shut down by the federal government. Well, what happens with the Oneida community is that they believe in creating this secular community, so religious community. They had the boarding houses, they had places to work. Everything was like inclusive, right? And so they created this community, but they had one part of their religion that everybody disagreed with. So they believed in what is known as a complex marriage, which is what I would write down on your paper, is called a complex marriage. This is where it gets a bit icky. So, a complex marriage is the idea that from birth unto death, everybody was married to everybody.
Nope.
It did not matter the relation of the people. It did not matter their gender or their age, whether it be a 62-year-old with a 9-year-old, it did not matter. Whether it be brother and sister, everybody was married to everybody. Now, a lot of people ask, why? Why would they have this idea? Well, it's the idea of procreating and creating a bigger church. More children, more members of the church, a bigger church following. The average woman in the Oneida community typically had 20 children during her lifetime. Typically starting at start of puberty, which at this point is 9-10 years old, until they eventually die. Normal average is about 20 to 25 children. Depends on the situation. So in this case scenario, though, the reason why they got shut down is why? It's against the law. So if you think about all the things that were happening, it really gets shut down later. Half of them get arrested due to all the things that were happening there, and they're now shut down. But it did last quite a long time of this religion. Everybody understand Oneida? Okay, so that brings us to the next one, which is going to be New Harmony. Now, this is not religious, so it shows that utopian communities don't have to be religious. So he brought up Waco, Texas, which was a compound in Texas that believed in political overthrow. And I would consider them a utopian community, even though they're political. So with this one, it was socialism. So what you need to know for New Harmony is socialism. Now, in the New Harmony community, they believed in 100% socialism. So no country today is a pure capitalist society. No country today is a pure socialist or communist. Everything is a mix. In this community, though, it is 100% socialist. Let me explain how it works. There is no money in this community. There are no wages in this community. Instead, every single person puts forth work in the factory. So this whole thing is a giant factory. They build metal, and they sell that metal. The money comes back to the community as a whole. The community then, whoever's in charge of it, buys food, clothing, shelter, whatever you need, and then divvies it equally amongst all the members. So, in theory, everybody is 100% the same in this community. Now, what also benefits from this is, let's pretend that you have a day that you don't want to work. If you tell somebody you don't want to work, great, you don't get fed for the day. You're sick, you didn't work, you don't get fed. So the idea is that everybody is 100%, it's equality. New Harmony lasted a long time. It lasted almost 100 years. So it was really, really popular until socialism goes out, and then it comes back about 20 years later. Not New Harmony, but socialism. Which brings us to our last person on this page, who is, okay, hold on. Who is going to be either Joseph Smith or Brigham Young. Hi, Mason. Erica. You've been chosen, and you already have to leave. Now, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, if you will star this, they talk about one of these two about every 2 to 3 years. Very, very popular. Now, both of them are going to be referred to, though, for very separate things. So both of them are religious reformers. If you know anything about the origins of the Mormon Church, you know that that burned out district is actually the original reason why it's created. It's because their founder, Joseph Smith, began to find a church. There were too many of them. They were burnt out. So he creates his own. Now, in terms of what you're going to see on the AP exam, the most popular thing is the most successful church from the Second Great Awakening. This is really the only major church that survives from the Second Great Awakening. They have about 15.2 million people or so around the world. And that's going to be what you're going to see with Joseph Smith. So if you ever see anything about Joseph Smith, it's either an example of burned out community, or it's also an example of being the most successful church. That brings us to the second most popular thing that you're going to see, which is polygamy. Now, Brigham Young is the person that you will see on a polygamy question. Reason why is if you don't know how the origins of the Mormon Church works, the original church wanted to get more people into what's called the covenant. It's basically the children of God. And so they began procreation, which is through polygamy, to get more members of the church. Then in the late 1800s, they ended the practice of polygamy because they didn't need it anymore. They had a sound church. Now, if you don't know what happens because of this, Brigham Young is the prophet, kind of like a pope and things like that, of the leader of the Mormon Church. He is probably one of the biggest polygamous leaders of the church. He had about 140 or so wives. But what happens is they end polygamy, and the big issue is that the church actually splits. So this thing that happened in Mexico, I've seen all the time on the TVs, they've been saying like they're the Mormons. They're not. They're part of what's called the FLDS Church. So the FLDS Church traditionally believes in the practice of polygamy, which is having, usually it's one husband with multiple wives, but you can have it opposite, which a lot of African countries have, where it's one wife with several husbands. But they advocate for the use of polygamy. A lot of the things in the Mormon Church and the FLDS Church are similar. Their biggest split is the idea of polygamy, but they are separate churches. Now, in terms of polygamy in Utah, much more common than you would think. I have several students in the past that have been from polygamous families. If you go out to Harriman, you'll actually see a whole bunch of polygamous communities out in Harriman, so it's much more common than you might think. Now, here in Salt Lake, the FLDS Church is much more modern than what people think in their heads. People's assumption in their heads is a very fundamentalist version of the FLDS Church. That is not here in Salt Lake for the most part. There are some families, but not a lot. Most of those families live in southern Utah in a place called Providence. So what there is on the border of Utah and Arizona, there is two cities that are the utopian communities for this church. That's where 98% of the city is this church. And if you're not a part of this church, you're going to become a part of it or you get kicked out of the city. So, for example, what happened a couple years ago is they actually had their police department and city government disbanded. The federal government banned them from being allowed to have that because of corruption. There was a family that moved into the area that didn't know about the situation. They went to school one day. They come back from school and work with the police at their house that said, you either join the church or you have your utilities cut off. So they cut off the water as well as the electric bill. Then they went to school and the teacher refused to give their children anything but F's unless they converted to the church. So all these different things that happen. So it's a lot of corruption down in the south. But that's not the traditional FLDS families. I think there's a lot of stereotypes about polygamy. It's a lot more common than you think. And we have a lot of Skyline students also who are from polygamous families. It's extremely common here in the Valley. But it is illegal. So in America, every single state, polygamy is illegal and against the law. But here in Utah, where we tend to convict people is not due to that. It's due to what's called cohabitation, which is a tax law of having more than one family live in the same home. You can't cohabit, which is why most families live in separate houses. So you'll have one house as the main house, and then all the other families will live in separate houses. So in traditional polygamous communities, you'll go to like a cul-de-sac, and all the houses will be that single family. But they won't live in the same house. So if you guys have ever heard of Sister Wives, so that Sister Wives show, they started in Utah. They moved because Utah kept charging them with cohabitation laws. Technically, they could charge them with polygamy laws, but we don't charge people a lot of time. We typically get cohabitation laws. It's the only class that hasn't asked me a question about polygamy or anything like that. So, yeah.
Why don't we charge them?
So it's the same reason why a lot of times we don't charge people with adultery. Here in Utah, adultery is against the law, up to 1 year in prison and a $500 fine.
What's adultery?
Adultery is cheating on your husband or wife. So when you're married, adultery is cheating. And according to the law, adultery is against the law. And in fact, if you go by the true letter of the law, a committed relationship is how it's referred to. So if like your boyfriend cheats on you, they technically are breaking the law. Now, do we ever charge people with that? No. So we have certain laws that are on the books that we just don't charge people with, but it's, hey, shh. But we still like have it on the books and things like that. In the modern day world, if you really wanted to, you could strip it from the law, but it's several $1 million to strip something off the law. So that's why we have those crazy laws of like you can't tie a elephant to a flagpole. There's like laws like that you hear about, weird laws. They're mostly from the 1800s, and we don't remove them because it's millions of dollars to remove. Because you have to do an education campaign, you have to go through the legislature, you have to pay people to do it, and you also, there's law books, so every law in the state of Utah is published in a book. You remove one law, you have to create an entire new set of law books. So it's very expensive. So for example, the UTA thing, UTA was going to rebrand and create a brand new name for itself in an attempt to get more people to join. They estimated it would cost about $540 million to rename UTA. That's just to rename them. We had the state tree changed a couple of years ago. That cost about $8 million to change. It's because we changed the state tree. So it just depends on your view. But yeah, so we tend to charge them with cohabitation. The sister wives that family was charged with from polygamy in Utah, but mostly they get charged with cohabitation laws.
Why are they still, how are they a TV show?
Well, that's exactly why it's showing they don't charge people with polygamy laws. So they created this TV show, and that's why after the TV show came, a lot of Utahns pressured the Utah State Legislature to do something about it because they said it was giving Utah a bad name. And so what they did is they began to really enforce the cohabitation, which is why they moved to Arizona. Or not Arizona, Nevada. Nevada has much more lax laws on cohabitation and polygamy compared to Utah. Utah is much more strict about it. But again, I mean, I could literally drive you out to Harriman and show you exactly where all those families live. So it's not like it's a secret. I will tell you that family, after they made a bunch of money from the TV show, they went and sued Utah saying that their polygamy laws were unconstitutional, and they lost. And so they did attempt to say that you should have this be legalized, and they did lose from it. So every single state, Mexico also has it illegal, but they had made an agreement with this community 50 years ago to allow polygamy in that one community in Mexico.
How much is it like if you get charged with polygamy or cohabitation?
Most of the time it's a fine. Cohabitation, the biggest thing that they're concerned about are like tax laws and stuff like that. I believe if you get charged with cohabitation, I'm not a genius, but I believe a first incident is about $1,000 fine, which is pretty hefty for a tax law fine. But you tend to get charged. Normally it's like code enforcement and things like that. It's the idea that they don't want multiple families living in the same place and not having it called an apartment. Because apartments, when multiple families live in the same place, you can't have that as cohabitation because they have to make sure, because if not, apartment buildings would just have a giant building and say they're not an apartment and not pay the fees. Okay, anyways, any more questions about that? Okay, so in terms of what you'll see on the AP exam, most successful church in polygamy. Now, here's my one big note about this subject. I am sure if you guys got a second grade awakening or a reformer assignment on the AP exam, you'd be so excited because you're like, oh my gosh, I at least know one thing about this subject. Your job on the AP exam is not to convert the reader. Your job is to educate the reader. Now, you might think that that is funny, but let me explain why I say that. A couple of years ago, I was reading AP exams on this subject. There was an LEQ on the international exam that was all about second grade awakening stuff. And somebody wrote this incredible essay on the Mormon Church. And then at the end, they said, and if you would like more information, please go to mormon.org. Now, this is very common in essays, and I notice right away when an essay is from Utah, Idaho, or Hawaii. Those are the three biggest states in terms of per capita LDS. I notice when they're from there because I can tell from the way that they write. I have read some amazing essays on the first vision, the first discussion, and all that stuff about theory, but that's not what they care about. They care about the things, okay? That's part of the reason, by the way, that we don't do him and the reformer speed dating. Very first year, I had him on the sheet that somebody could have, and very first class period, I had somebody giving out the number for the LDS missionaries, and then Book of Mormon, so the whole class. And that kind of became an issue. So, what I would like to say is from there, just, you guys understand what I mean? So if you're going to write this stuff, don't go in depth about the religion because they don't care about that. They care about the history. Make sense? Okay, great. So now that we're on from that, let's talk about the next thing about religion, which is called transcendentalism. So next page. So transcendentalism is the idea that you are allowed to have personal religious study based on your personal experience. So, I want you to think, for example, of how the times used to be. Back in the olden days, which, by the way, if you've been on your cell phone now, I think that's 6 times I've noticed you. I just want to point out to you that your AP exam is in about 65 class days. Just wanted to point that out to you if you choose to be on that iMessage instead of listening to this. So, anyways, so with transcendentalism, back in the day, in the 1800s, your religion was what your preacher told you. Your preacher told you, I had a revelation from God and this is what he thinks. Sure, you can read the Bible, but you don't understand it because you're not connected with God like I am. So you can read it, but I'm going to tell you how to interpret it. Now, if you're religious, I want you to think in your head, do I pray at least once a week to God? Or whatever your deity is. Or 2, do you ever read a religious text, such as the Bible, the Quran, or something like that? If you do any of those, that is transcendentalism. It's the idea that you also can have personal revelation. So let's pretend, for example, that you're reading the Bible and you see a verse and you're like, oh, this is how I can apply that and change my life around that. Back in the day, you couldn't do that. Transcendentalism is the idea that you can interpret your own religion based on your personal experience. Okay? So, some famous transcendentalists are people such as Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in this idea of hope and desire, and again, all of these are things that if you don't have them on your notes, I would add them to your notes. Most of you should have, in theory, had this down last class period, but in case you didn't. So Ralph Waldo Emerson had this idea of hope, desire, different things like that. And it was the idea that not everything in church has to be you're going to hell. Some things can also be about hope and love and desire to be better. And all that can work. Now, another guy, Henry David Thoreau, you can thank your educational experience to him. He had a problem. He went to a math class one time, and while he was in math, the kids were learning addition. And then once the math class was over, he said to the kids, hey, here is my coins. Count how many coins I have. And add up the amount of money I have. And they said, oh, I can't do that. I can only do math. That's because back then, math was just equations. Nothing of it applied to your real life. So if you've ever done word problems, that's all his idea. Now, in terms of religion, the idea is personal experience. What can you do at home, such as reading the Bible, praying? All those are ways you can have personal experiences and real life experience and apply what you learned in your church. Now, from there, we'll go to the abolitionists. Now, we've talked about abolition in the past. Abolition is the idea of getting rid of slavery, and the 2 major causes are traditionally Christianity, as well as political representation of that 3/5 compromise. Now, the 2 abolitionists on your paper, I would go ahead and star those 2. Both of those are very important people, and if you want to put next to them, too, and bracket them, you can also put cause of the Civil War. Each of these are people that you can reference in a Civil War essay as well. So we'll start with William Lloyd Garrison. Now, William Lloyd Garrison creates a major abolitionist newspaper in an attempt to convince people that they should be able to get rid of slavery. Now, here's one big thing about him. If you look at his picture, what race is he? He's white. Now all of a sudden you have somebody who's white saying that African Americans should not be a slave. That's a huge deal. Well, I'm white. Should I also not think that? It's not just Africans that are thinking they shouldn't be slaves. It's other people too. So his race became a major factor. The other thing too is he creates the first anti-slavery society that people can join in an attempt to get rid of slavery in the United States. Now, Frederick Douglass is the famous African American abolitionist. Now, Frederick Douglass believed that he should be able to, or that he can help by becoming more prominent and helping in politics. I heard English class is reading his book right now. Yeah, I heard a lot of English classes are reading it. So you already got a one up on everybody else. Now, he writes this book about his experiences, and it helps encourage people to move towards the abolitionist movement. He was heavily involved in politics, and also he created what's known as the North Star, which was his major newspaper during this time. That was also an abolitionist newspaper. Which brings us to suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote. Now, during this time, do women have the right to vote? No. So they're going to begin to advocate. What you need to know for this section are the names. Now, all the names in general are going to be used for the exact same thing. So you don't necessarily need to know about the people individually, as long as you know the greater idea. All of these women are going to advocate for women's suffrage, but they fail. So at this time, they advocate for women's suffrage, but they fail. Okay? Now, one thing I want you to write next to this or below this is if you want to put down the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. The Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. This was a primary source they basically took the Declaration of Independence, they rewrote it in an attempt to convince people that they should have women to have the right to vote. That's a popular source that you will see. From there, we're going to head to our next one, which is called Romanticism. You can go ahead and do whatever you're going to do. So, Romanticism is the idea of an unrealistic or fantasy representation of the world. If you've ever heard of the phrase, looking through rose-colored glasses, that's an idea of basically you work at the world in a fantasy world of how perfect everything is. So I want you to picture social media. Most of you have probably scrolled through Snapchat or Instagram in the past. I'm going to exclude Twitter because 2A yesterday told me that Twitter is where everybody yells at each other. So we're going to ignore Twitter, and we're going to go Instagram and Snapchat. Okay? Now, I want you to think of boyfriends and girlfriends. And I want you to think of what you see your friends post about on social media about their boyfriends or their girlfriends. What do you traditionally see? You'll see like cute little hand pictures where they're holding each other's hand, or like they'll have a picture of like them in class and be like, I just can't stop looking at how beautiful he is. You'll have like, what's that? Okay, dance pictures. Perfect. You'll see things like Men Crush Monday, Women Crush Wednesday, and they'll be like, I can't believe it's our 3-day anniversary. It's as if we've been together for 1,000,000 years. You guys probably know what I'm talking about, right? It's the perfect picture that some of you are like, I've never been on a date before, so I have no idea. Well, one day you will, okay? One day you will, trust me. If I got married, you can get married too. Just, that's your bar. So, I never went on a date in high school, and it worked out for me, so it's all right. Now, in terms of the reality of those pictures, right? The perfect filter, the perfect backdrop, they probably took like 30 pictures to get that one, right? What's the reality of a lot of dating, right? The reality of a lot of dating are people who are getting into fights, people that are angry at each other, people that are texting each other angrily. Do you tend to see something on Snapchat that's something on the lines of, I can't believe this bozo was late again? Probably not. Or, for example, do you see anything that's such as like an ugly picture and they're like, wow, this guy's so ugly, I can't believe I date him, right? Usually not. Now, unless you guys maybe do see that, then that's sad, okay? Now, the reality is, what do most people put on social media? The perfect things in their life and not the things that are real life, right? No family is perfect, and yet what do you see on social media? The perfect life. Now, if you feel like that's not what you're going to see, wait till you become an adult. When you become an adult, my entire feed on social media revolves around people getting new jobs, going on fancy trips, getting a house, having a baby, or whatever it could be. That's always what I see. There is no, I didn't pay rent because I couldn't afford it. There was no... Guys, just wait. That's going to happen to you, I promise. Yeah.
I got kicked out of my apartment this month.
Yeah, exactly. You don't see, like, I got kicked out of my apartment. You don't see I'm late on my credit card bill. You don't see those things. Now, okay, listen. You guys think it's funny, you just wait. You just wait until you are struggling to pay rent, and then you'll feel. Okay, now, that's what romanticism is. Romanticism is that fake social media that everybody portrays as perfect when it's really not. Okay? Now, in terms of, the best example of this is going to be what's known as the Hudson River School. Now, this was an art movement that was all about how beautiful America is. It begins near the Hudson River, but spread throughout America. And I'll have a lot of people say, was it a school? No, it's similar to a phrase like cubism, for example, or realism, those art types. This is an art movement. Now, I'm going to show you this picture. This picture is someplace in the continental United States. And I want you to see if you can identify where this picture, so think where this picture looks most similar to. Any ideas? Tetons? Anybody else? Yosemite? Okay, anybody else? This, my friends, is New York City. Yes, which is beautiful towering mountains, and it's beautiful deer along the lakes. So this picture is of New York City. Now, the reality is this what New York City looks like? If you've been to New York, is that how it looks like? No. Okay, it's the opposite. Okay. So New York City at this time is portrayed as this because they are trying to show how pure America was. So romanticism really is the romantic version. And a lot of people in Europe, this is the only picture they saw of New York when they came, and that's what they were expecting. If you've ever been to New York, they were disappointed. Okay? Oh, I hate New York. I feel really bad because I have like a negative image of New York. But I've been to New York so many times, probably 7 times in my life. And it's fun the first time, but then like it starts to smell, and then there's trash. And then like I had a really bad experience where somebody accused me of stealing his bike, and so I'm traumatized. Because I was getting on the train and somebody's bike got like stuck in the door. So I was like, oh, I'll help them. So I like pried the doors open and helped guide their bike into the train. And they're like, are you trying to steal my bike? That's my bike. I'm going to call the police. And they called 911. It was scary. So that's what New York is like. Okay, anyways. So that's what the Hudson River School is. Now, there are 2 blanks that are less likely to be on the AP exam. This class had too few people to add them in, so that's why I'm doing it for you. So if you see a James Fenimore Cooper, if you've ever heard of the movie Last of the Mohicans, some of you have probably done it in like orchestra and stuff like that. So he creates this book all about Native Americans and what happens to them. And really people became more aware of the travesties of natives, but it's not what you think. It's not like in today's world where somebody watches a documentary and they're like, oh my gosh, like we got to change something and help them. In this case, it's like, oh, those poor natives, we were so bad to them. Let's help them by taking their land and putting them on reservations. That's what happens. So we're going to talk about in a little bit in like 40 years of us helping based on this image of the natives during James Fenimore Cooper's. But he wrote that book, Last of the Mohicans. And then McGuffrey's Reader, if you've ever read Go Dog Go, this is the original Go Dog Go. It was basic readers that helped encourage reading for everybody. It was very cheap for people, and because of that, it became very popular. Now let's get to the really famous people on this side that you want to know. You want to know Horace Mann. Some of you in the past have gone to Horace Mann Elementary School nearby. Horace Mann is created because he offered free public education from 1st to 3rd grade. So basically, basic math and English, and you can write your name. Now, he advocated for free public education, which later became our education system today. And then we go to Dorothea Dix. Now, she is a starred term. On every DBQ I've ever seen as a practice DBQ, they've always had Dorothea Dix. So she's one's really important. Now, Dorothea Dix advocates for what's known as prison reform. And prison reform is basically an attempt to fix the problems, in particular in insane asylums. Now, back then, how it worked is if you were declared insane, they brought you to an insane asylum. This is not some mental hospital that's trying to help you. An insane asylum, you actually typically give up your parental rights. You give them that person, and you disown that person. You never visit them again, and they usually live the rest of their lives in this asylum, and that's typically a very short life. And the reason why is because they do anything they can to cure you. So, for example, and this, by the way, is back when we have Down syndrome and autism. Those words don't exist at this time. So instead, they're going to try to fix you in ways that they think your brain is messed up. So one way that they thought is resetting the brain. Resetting the brain basically means that your brain goes so crazed that it realizes if I want something, I have to reset it. Your brain will, in theory, reset itself and therefore make you a normal person. So think of somebody with Down syndrome having their brain reset. How they would reset is oftentimes withholding food. The idea of starvation would cause your brain to reset itself. So oftentimes, this Dorothea Dix, she went undercover in this insane asylum in these prisons, and she would watch the people of the doctors dangle food in front of people and make them like crawl to them, and then as soon as they would go to reach for the food, they would eat the food. And the idea of that is it would reset your brain because it needs food so badly, but what happened instead, people literally died of starvation. Another really awful example is what's called a lobotomy. So this is one way that Down syndrome and autism was cured. They thought that those illnesses were due to pressure on the brain. So what they would do is they would take a drill and they would drill into your skull. Right before they go to your brain, they would stop and not hit your brain. It would relieve pressure and, in theory, cure you. What happened instead is it didn't cure anybody, but what it did cause is oftentimes people would become paralyzed, unable to speak or walk because they accidentally hit the brain. And sometimes they drill too far into the brain, it kills you. Oftentimes insane asylums had cemeteries right behind the insane asylum that you would be buried in after you died. But again, most people, you drop them off, you never see them again. Now, why could you possibly be admitted to these insane asylums? That's really interesting. It's not just like schizophrenia today. Instead, it's several reasons. So this is a list. The right column is the amount of people that were admitted because of this. So let's see why you could be admitted at this time. So, for example, let's pretend that you have indigestion. So you drink Pepto-Bismol because your stomach is feeling bad. You can be admitted to an insane asylum for that. You can see that it says things like intense study, which meant that you were so interested in study that you didn't have a personal life and go out. So if you studied for 2-3 hours a day, you were an intense studier, and therefore were insane and were put into an insane asylum. Okay? If you keep notice that they had unkind treatment of relatives. So for example, you were really mean to your relatives. So if you totally hate on your aunt or uncle, put you in an insane asylum. You'll also notice a couple of these are extremely specific, such as a concussion from an explosion of a steamboat. Okay? That's more than likely PTSD, but PTSD does not exist until 1980. If you notice, too, you also have things like a sudden cessation of bleeding from the nose. That's a nosebleed. So if you're one of the people that oftentimes gets nosebleeds, that was one reason that they could put you into an asylum back then.
Excessive loss of blood?
Yes, excessive loss of blood, which again, normally is probably that person is just sick, but they interpret it as a mental illness. Yeah, loss of husband, which probably is depression, to be honest with you. Loss of husband, if you notice on a couple of these, there's loss of wife, loss of husband, loss of children. More than likely, that's depression. Jaundice, yeah, so we've talked. So here's the thing though. People back then didn't realize what causes jaundice. And there was no treatment like we have today. My son was born with severe jaundice, but back then, you were just yellowed. Now, some people can get jaundice today, which it comes from deficiencies in your blood. And so, but they thought back then, well, you're turning yellow, so that obviously means that you're crazy. Okay? And so it's really different than it is now. Han. Yes.
How do they know if your brain like reset?
Well, in theory, you wouldn't start having the same thing. So what happened is they typically, those starting ones were how they started. And if it doesn't work, which of course it's not going to work, right? I mean, how are you going to cure autism with withholding food from people? And so instead, that's when they try these other techniques. One example that they started with is electroshock therapy. So that's when they start by shocking the brain. They thought that if you shocked it, kind of like on a car, you jolt it and then that causes it to start up. No, so that's how people thought that the brain works. You jolt it and it reset itself.
They still do that today.
Well, I will say though, so James brought up that they still do electroshock therapy today. It is much different today. So back then, it was like a shock that was only about 10 volts less than what killed you in the electric chair. Nowadays, a lot of people actually do similar things with electroshock therapy, but they don't realize it. So like when I was a kid, a really popular thing that therapists did is they would have you put like a hair tie or a rubber band on your wrist. And then whenever you thought of something that you would do bad, such as like this was really popular for smoking, is you would pull it and it would snap. And what happens is over time, if you ever heard of Pavlov and his experiment, over time, you feel that pain without realizing it. So you'll think, oh, I want to smoke, ow, pain, and you're not actually doing it. So the idea of electroshock therapy is that you think or you do an action. Most famously, this is how they got rid of stutters, is that's how they originally thought of to get rid of stutters. You would stutter and they would shock you. So then eventually there's no shock to you. You stutter, you feel that shock, and you're discouraged from doing it. It's Pavlov's experiment, but before Pavlov existed. But nowadays, that's how they do electroshock therapy. So a lot of people with especially addictions to video gaming, they treat that with electroshock therapy. Also cell phone addiction and things like that all get treated through electroshock. Okay, anyways, but it's much more violent back then. So Dorothea Dix saw this, felt like it was a problem. She wrote this book about her 6 years undercover. It caused a massive amount of prison reform change, but most mental asylums are not fixed until really the 1940s when we start to do more research on what makes people have mental issues and different things like that. Okay? So from there, the last one, Neil Estelle, if you'll just put next to him the word temperance, I noticed a lot of people have the word prohibition. Prohibition is just the prohibiting of alcohol. Temperance is the abstaining from alcohol. So they're the same terms. They can be used interchangeably. But during this time, they wanted to get rid of drinking. So they began to advocate for getting rid of drinking. We talked about that before, the violence and different things like that. So from there, you need to grab out your Bear Flag notes. Yeah. They're over in the box. They're underneath the notes from last time. Okay, so what is the last thing that we highlighted? What did we highlight? Okay. Alrighty then. So we need to move along here. Okay. Did we talk about the Alamo? Yeah? Okay. All right, so as a quick reminder about all the stuff that's going on down in Texas. So as a quick reminder, the Texas Revolution begins. Remember, Americans move into Texas in an attempt to be able to get more land for slavery, as well as general manifest destiny in moving west. However, Mexico does not like that. Texians go to war for their independence in what's known as the Texas Revolution. Now, the biggest reasons for this, again, is slavery and that manifest destiny. Now, we talked about last class about how they had different events happen. So the Alamo, the Goliad, all this massive destruction and awfulness by Santa Anna. Now, in response, we win the Battle of San Jacinto. Santa Anna, on the threat of death, is going to give us three things. Number one, he surrenders. Number two, he gives all the lands to the United States to the Rio Grande. And number three, Mexico immediately disputes that. And the reason why is because they said that Texas is a rebellious state. So, for example, in the Civil War, we never said the Confederate States were another nation. We said they were rebellious states because we didn't accept that. In today's world, Taiwan is a great example. Taiwan is not considered a country from most countries. If you go to England, their map does not include Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. And that's because Taiwan is considered a rebellious state for the last 40 or so years. The United States is only one of, I think, 3 countries that recognize Taiwan as a nation. Now, following the Texas Revolution, there immediately gets some controversy over this Texas. So what's going to happen with Texas? Well, first, we can't just make it a state. The reason why we knew, 1, what's going to happen, slave versus free, and 2, we did not want to go to war with Mexico. We knew if we took Texas, it would cause immediate war. So Martin Van Buren becomes the president, and you're not going to see about him a lot on the AP exam, but what you might see is if you will highlight that he was a Democrat, and if you will highlight that he was committed to keeping Jackson's beliefs. So Martin Van Buren becomes the president, continues to do exactly like Andrew Jackson. And the problem is, he gets rid of the National Bank along with Jackson, and it creates a massive economic crisis. If you will highlight the Panic of 1837. So the Panic of 1837 goes off. It kind of ruins Van Buren's presidency. And because of that, a new president gets elected after only 1 term, named William Henry Harrison. What happens to him? He dies. Okay? So, William Henry Harrison goes into the presidency, he dies, and instead, a guy named John Tyler becomes the president. Now, John Tyler is a very interesting person. If you've ever said to yourself, I don't care what people think about me, whatever, you've never met John Tyler. He literally did not care about what people think of him at all. In fact, he is elected as a Whig, and guess what he actually is? A Democrat. Imagine if Donald Trump, on his inaugural address, came out and said, oh, by the way, guys, I'm a heavy-set Democrat, and I love Hillary Clinton. Imagine if he said that. That would shock people, right? Well, that's what happened with John Tyler. He gets elected as a Whig, but he was actually a Democrat. So make sure you highlight that first one. He was a Whig, but actually supported the Democrats. And because of this, he vetoed almost 95% of all the bills. Basically, nothing gets passed at this time. This caused his entire cabinet to resign, and he was kicked out of his own party. So everybody rejects him as a president. Now, the one thing he does do, though, if you will highlight at the bottom, he does annex Texas as a state. Annexation means that we literally declare this is a state. Imagine if Donald Trump tomorrow comes onto the TV and says, we have just annexed Japan, and Japan is now the 51st state. That's how basically it works. Now, we do this twice in our presidency, one with Texas and one with Hawaii. We annex both of them and create them into our own states. We also do several territories, but those are the only ones that become our actual United States. Now, other interesting things about John Tyler. First off, John Tyler actually became a major political figure in the Confederacy. So, part of the Union, he becomes a Confederate, and he has 2 living grandchildren. One is 98 years old, and one is 100 years old. He gave birth to his last child at the age of 72. Okay? So he does have, so imagine if you're like, oh, Grandpa was born in 1790. That's how it was. Okay? Now, in terms of what happens next, of course our boy, Henry Clay, attempts to become the president. Now, this is Henry Clay. Oh, what are you guys laughing at? He tried really hard. Okay? Now, Henry Clay is going to try for the presidency for the 3rd time. Now, Henry Clay goes to do the presidency, and he's going to win by a landslide. Everybody supports him. Everybody loves Henry Clay. In fact, when he finds out that he lost the presidency, he was at his celebration party for winning the presidency. Everybody thought he was going to win. But here's what made the difference. Henry Clay was a Whig, and put in a letter, he did not support the annexation of Texas or Manifest Destiny. He believed it was economically unsound. At this time, though, what does everybody believe? Manifest destiny. So he did not agree with moving west. So instead, random dude, James K. Polk, becomes the president. Now, when I explain random dude, I literally mean he was a random dude. Okay, the Democrats needed somebody to win. They couldn't find somebody. Andrew Jackson was like, oh, I remember that one guy from like 15 years ago. Tells him to run for president. 50% of the voters who voted for him didn't even know his name. They just voted for the word Democrat. And there's a famous story of when he's giving his inaugural address and literally somebody raised their hand, a reporter, and was like, sorry, sir, I can't remember your name. Can you tell me one more time? And wrote it down. Nobody knew who he was. On the front page at the bottom for the causes of the war, this is on there of his election. He wins the election simply due to manifest destiny in Texas. He wanted more land. Henry Clay did not, so Henry Clay loses the presidency simply on the idea of manifest destiny. Nobody knew who Henry Clay or who James K. Polk was. They are going to, though, in just a second. So Polk also, by the way, so this is on the back page again, sorry. If you will put next to back page. If you will highlight in his presidency, he wins on the thing called 54-40 or fight. So in the last bullet about Polk's presidency, he wins on 54-40 or fight. Now that phrase comes from Oregon. At this point, Oregon goes up to the 54th parallel and is really high up there, and they want to be able to get it. So the 54th parallel basically is going to say we're going to acquire all of Oregon as well as Texas. Now this is how it ends up being. Henry Clay loses the vote, and James K. Polk is going to win. He immediately, along with John Tyler, annexes Texas and puts us into war. So right at the start of the presidency is going to begin the Mexican-American War. So what you need to know about the Mexican-American War. Oftentimes they'll have a causation essay on the causes of the Mexican-American War, which is a list of like 10 different things that causes it, and effects. That's normally what you're going to see. If you also want to put next to Mexican-American War, cause of the Civil War. The Mexican-American War is a great example of a cause of the Civil War. So, in terms of what happens during the war. So immediately James K. Polk sends Zachary Taylor, who was known as Old Rough and Ready because he was old, he looks really rough, but he was ready to kill people. So Zachary Taylor gets sent to Texas, to the Rio Grande to defend it. And he begins a quick campaign and very successful campaign against the Mexicans. Now what happens is, why did James K. Polk do this? So you can see that this is his justification. So it says, Mexico has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon the American soil. War exists by the act of Mexico herself. Now, Polk believed Mexico invaded American territory. What does Mexico believe? Texas is their own territory. Americans invaded, so the difference. Now, this random guy is also going to say, President Polk is deeply conscious of being in the wrong that he ordered General Taylor into the midst of peaceful American settlement purposely to bring the war. Who is this guy? That's Abe Lincoln. That is a very attractive 35-year-old Abraham Lincoln. And he is going to advocate to not go into this war. This is one of Lincoln's first major things that he says about his political campaigning. Now, one thing you need to know about the Mexican-American War is disease, and controversy. Reason why is that controversy is going to be all about the terrible things the Mexicans did. Basically, it was a propaganda war. So we looked at incidents like the Goliad and the Alamo, and we published them in our newspapers and said multiple times how awful and terroristic the Mexicans were. Here's the thing, though. Did we do the same thing to the Mexicans? Yes. We did the exact same thing to the Mexicans, but again, it doesn't get published. Also, disease. 2/3 of our people died of disease. Mostly is because we didn't know germ theory existed. So we're sitting along the Rio Grande fighting the Mexican army. People got to go to the bathroom. Oh, perfect. There's a river, so it doesn't stay in your spot. They go to the bathroom near the river or in the river. Down the river are people that are also in your army drinking water from that same river. And they all died. Now, you think of that now, but you have to remember back then, germ theory wasn't a thing. We didn't realize that people catch things from people. We didn't realize that that was a thing back then. Now, let's talk about California. So over in California, they want independence too. So they want to become their independent nation just like Texas. They're currently controlled by the Mexican government. So what they do is what's called the Bear Flag Revolt. The bear flag, if you don't know, that's a golden bear. Golden bears are extinct now, but they're much larger than a grizzly bear. In California, in San Francisco, they kidnapped the governor of California, put a gun to his head and said, "We are now an independent nation," right? And the guy underneath that strap said, and for the next 2 months, they are an independent nation of California. And then the Mexicans arrive. And then the Californians ask America for annexation. They go in, they fight it, they annex it, and now it becomes now part of the United States. That's why California's flag is still the Bear Flag Revolt flag. Now, Polk is going to end this war. Now, Polk, in my opinion, who also, I think that he looks a lot like the guy from Star Wars.
He does.
Yeah, I know. So Polk wants to end this war. So he sends a guy named Nicholas Trist, who I will put next to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So he sends Trist to end the war. But there's a problem. Trist believes in better diplomatic relations with Mexico. And so what they instead do is that Trist down there signs what's known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. If you'll go ahead and highlight that. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is going to end the Mexican-American War, but it does not result in what Polk wanted. Polk wanted all of Mexico, as in from that border all the way down to Guatemala. He wanted all of that as American land. Trist believed that would contribute to more and more war that would never end. So instead, he is going to sign this and pays money to them. Polk did not want any money. That was our war thing that we took. Why would we give them money for something we wanted in a war? So instead, Trist does this. How do you think Polk feels about this incident? Oh, he is not happy. In fact, Polk is so flippin' angry that he sends Winfield Scott, the head general of the U.S. Army, to go and arrest Nicholas Trist for treason. He arrests him, attempts to execute him. The execution is denied, and instead he spends the rest of his life in prison for treason because he gave Mexico a break. Now, later on, a guy named Franklin Pierce becomes the president. He sends Gadsden down to get the final plot of land that we did not get. So if you look at this map, he's going to get that part right underneath Arizona in New Mexico in what is known as the Gadsden Purchase. Now, the reason for the Gadsden Purchase, if you want to highlight, is for the Transcontinental Railroad. Not Big T Transcontinental Railroad, Little T, which is the actual first Transcontinental Railroad. So they wanted to create this Transcontinental Railroad across the whole nation, but the lower part needed to connect, and they wanted it in that perfect land. So they bought it, and that creates our last land acquisition of the continuous United States. Now, the Mexican Cession, by the way, if you want to put that up next to Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Mexican Cession is what we acquire for that $15 million. Now, after the war, Zachary Taylor, old Rough and Ready, goes and campaigns with Millard Fillmore for the presidency. You should know Millard Fillmore used to be the capital of Utah. So they go to campaign, but people don't want this because they believe this is too expansionist. And they create what's known as the Free Soil Party, if you want to go ahead and star that. This, by the way, is a great effect of the war. The major effects are really the debates over slavery. Is Texas going to become free or slave? And the Free Soil Party. And if you want to highlight that all new territories would be free of slavery, that was their goal. We'll talk about this more extensively in our next unit about the Civil War. Now, Oregon gets acquired by James K. Polk. Remember that 54-40 or fight? That's what he wanted. So he wanted to take all of Oregon, but instead they split Oregon. Now, why would America want Oregon? Well, there were so many people already going into Oregon already. especially along the Oregon Trail. Now, in particular, Christian missionaries. So it's the Whitman family. The Whitman family were a group of Christian missionaries. They went into Oregon with their 10 children, attempted to Christianize the Native Americans. Instead, the Native Americans responded by killing all the children with an axe, and then eventually killing the wife, and then eventually the husband. So the idea is that American settlers wanted American protection. So we are going to split Oregon at the 49th parallel. Make sure you highlight that. You need to know the 49th parallel. And then that becomes the Oregon Territory and later into Oregon and Washington. Now, California, after the acquirement in the Mexican Cession, becomes a huge thing due to the California Gold Rush. What happens is this guy named John Sutter is going to be out digging next to his home when he finds gold. But he just doesn't find a little bit of gold. He says that he finds everything is gold. He says he can kick up the dust and there's gold on the ground. He goes and digs into the rivers and there's gold everywhere. He said there's so much gold that it weighed as much as an elephant. All these different things. He sends a letter to the president who publishes it in the newspaper, and it kickstarts the gold rush. But here's the thing, it never happened. He sent it to get more and more people to move into California to get more economy. Instead, it begins the California Gold Rush. Well, the thing about the California Gold Rush is people beginning mass movement to California to get this money. If you want a great way to know when it is 1849. Best way to remember, the San Francisco 49ers. San Francisco 49ers in California are named after the 49ers who were the gold miners. So all these gold miners begin to move to California. If you want to highlight, most of these were young single men. We'll talk about the immigration after this unit because our immigration is in the next unit. Now, ways that you can get to California. Now, the original way you would think would be over the prairies, but that takes too long. So instead, people begin to go through there by going through a boat to be able to get over into California. But the journey was really long. The original journeys went below the tip of South America, but that was 2 months. You need to be there now. So instead, you cut through Panama. There's no Panama Canal. So you would stop on the banks of Panama, walk across Panama, which is about 22 miles long, and on to the other side. Great idea. It only takes you a month, except for the fact that 75% of you die of yellow fever. So all these people, though, were willing to risk it to get more and more money. Now, in terms of the positive effects of the gold rush, massive economic growth and population movement. But the biggest thing are the negatives, in particular that last bullet, conflicts over slavery in the Copper Bays of 1820. We will talk about this especially when we get to the Civil War. But is California going to become free or slave? The other thing is, too, increase in delinquent behaviors. The gold rush was only 3 years, and then all the gold was gone. And so all these people went in an attempt to get more money. They didn't get it. So alcoholism rises, drug use rises, suicide rates rises, different things like that. And then massive decline in the native population. We'll talk about that later. So from there, we have the next 8 minutes in class.